The chandeliers at Ethel, Chicago's temple of molecular gastronomy, dripped light like frozen diamonds onto the hushed patrons below. The air, usually a delicate perfume of yuzu foam and seared wagyu, was thick tonight with a different, more metallic scent. Fear. Tariq al-Sultan had arrived, and his presence altered the room's atmosphere as surely as a drop in barometric pressure precedes a tornado. He was not merely a billionaire. He was a force of nature, a real estate titan who had reshaped skylines across the globe. But his true power, the power that silenced this room of CEOs and socialites, was not in his portfolio of steel and glass. It was in his palate. In the world of high cuisine, Tariq al-Sultan was the ultimate arbiter, a self-proclaimed connoisseur whose word could mint a 3-star Michelin chef or bankrupt a century-old institution. His visits were not meals, they were inquisitions. And tonight, a 22-year-old waitress named Amelia Hayes, a girl from the Illinois prairie who was as invisible to him as the air he breathed, was about to commit an act of catastrophic blasphemy. She was about to tell the emperor he had no taste. The warning rippled from the maitre d's stand, a silent shock wave that stilled forks midair. "The scythe is at table 7. The nickname was whispered, never spoken aloud in his presence. Tariq al-Sultan didn't just critique a meal, he harvested reputations. He moved with a predatory grace, a man carved from obsidian and tailored by Savile Row. His lineage was rumored to trace back to the spice lords of the ancient world, a fiction he cultivated as carefully as the orchids in his penthouse conservatory. His eyes, dark and restless, did not merely see, they appraised, they dissected, they judged. They were the eyes of a hawk circling a field mouse, already tasting the end. He was dining tonight with a food critic from the New York Times, a man whose own formidable reputation seemed to wilt in al-Sultan's shadow. They were seated at the chef's table, an altar of polished granite offering a direct view into the kitchen's balletic chaos, and more importantly, a stage for all to see him. Chef Julian Morrow, the restaurant's owner and a culinary prodigy burdened by a mountain of debt, personally presented the first course. His usual fiery confidence was gone, replaced by the taut anxiety of a bomb disposal expert. "Mr. al-Sultan," Julian began, his voice strained. "Tonight, a journey. We begin with a single diver scallop, poached in clarified seawater and resting on a bed of sea urchin panna cotta. It is dusted with—" Al-Sultan held up a hand, a gesture that was both languid and absolute. The critic fell silent. Chef Julian froze. Al-Sultan closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, theatrically. He took a minuscule bite, letting it dissolve on his tongue. The silence in the dining room stretched, thin and fragile. "Fascinating, Julian," Al-Sultan finally murmured, his voice a low purr that carried across the room. "You've procured it. I wasn't sure it was possible." The critic leaned in. "Procured what, Tariq?" "The saffron of the Atlas," Al-Sultan announced, opening his eyes. They glittered with the pleasure of his own perceived genius. "From Morocco, not the common commercial threads. This is the wild variety, harvested by Berber women under a full moon, from altitudes above 2,000 meters. Its terroir is unmistakable. Notes of dried honey, a whisper of ancient leather, and that characteristic, tragic bitterness on the finish. Most palates," he added with a dismissive wave that encompassed everyone else in the room, "would mistake it for common Spanish saffron. But to one who knows, it is the difference between a violin and a Stradivarius." The critic scribbled furiously in his notepad. Chef Julian let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a faint, relieved smile touching his lips. He had not used Moroccan saffron, but if the most feared palate in the world said he had, then he had. The lie was a gift. From across the room, near the sommelier station where she was decanting a bottle of Romanée Conti, Amelia Hayes went perfectly still. The rich, ruby liquid swirled in the crystal decanter, but she didn't see it. A memory, sharp and vivid as a photograph, bloomed in her mind. A sun-drenched prairie field, the buzz of insects, and her grandmother's weathered hands gently plucking the tiny, flame-orange petals of a wildflower. "This here is prairie fire, sweet girl," her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. The old ones used it when they couldn't get the pricey stuff from the city. Looks like saffron, smells a little like it, but it has a secret of its own. A little bit of smoke, a little bit of earth. You have to know the land to find it, and you have to know your heart to use it right. Amelia was an observer. It was a skill honed by a childhood spent in the quiet company of nature, learning the subtle language of plants and seasons. She saw things others missed. And in Chef Julien's kitchen, she saw everything. She had seen him 2 days ago, meticulously tweezing the thread-like stamens from a bundle of dried wildflowers a forager had brought from downstate. She had recognized them instantly. It was her grandmother's flower, prairie fire, a humble weed, financially worthless, that required an artist's touch to balance its faint, smoky profile. Tariq al-Sultan was wrong. And he wasn't just wrong in a minor, academic way. He was spectacularly, foundationally, arrogantly wrong. He hadn't identified a rare and expensive spice. He had tasted a common wildflower from the American Midwest, and in a desperate bid to showcase his own worldly brilliance, had invented a ludicrously romantic fantasy to explain it. He was a fraud. A slow, hot anger began to build in Amelia's chest, an unfamiliar and unsettling sensation. It was one thing for al-Sultan to be cruel, to hold the livelihoods of talented people in his manicured hands. It was another thing entirely to desecrate the very essence of what food meant to her. For Amelia, food was not about status or rarity. It was about truth. It was the story of the soil, the sun, the rain. It was the memory of her grandmother's hands, the legacy of generations who understood the land. Tariq al-Sultan spoke of terroir, but he was a man utterly disconnected from any earth. He collected flavors like he collected skyscrapers, as hollow trophies, devoid of story or soul. "Amelia, table 7 needs more bread," whispered Carlos, another server, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror at al-Sultan's pronouncement. "Did you hear that? Saffron from the moon? Chef is a genius." Amelia looked at Carlos's starstruck face, then back at the man at table 7, who was now accepting the critic's fawning praise with the bored grace of a deity. To challenge him would be more than professional suicide. Chef Julien would fire her on the spot. Al-Sultan would likely see to it that she never waited tables in Chicago again, perhaps not anywhere. He was a man who salted the earth of his enemies. Her mind was a whirlwind. The voice of reason, of survival, begged her to stay silent, to just bring the man his bread and let the lie stand. She was a waitress, a nobody. Her knowledge, born of dirt and sun, was worthless currency in this temple of finance and foam. But another voice, the voice of her grandmother, the voice that believed in the simple, unadorned truth of a handful of petals, whispered back. "A lie in the food is a lie in the heart, sweet girl. It poisons everything." She thought of Chef Julien, a true artist, so terrified that he would accept this man's fantasy rather than stand by his own creation. And she thought of the humble prairie fire blossom being used as a prop in a billionaire's theater of arrogance. In that moment, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled over her. It wasn't about courage, it was about honesty. Honesty for her grandmother's memory, for the integrity of the ingredients, and for the brilliant, terrified chef in the kitchen who had dared to use them. She placed the decanter on the service bar. She smoothed the front of her crisp black apron. She picked up the warm linen-wrapped basket of sourdough bread and began to walk toward table 7. She had no strategy, no grand design. She had only a simple, humble truth. And she was about to throw it like a stone at a giant made of glass. The world seemed to contract as Amelia approached the table. The low murmur of the dining room dissolved into a distant hum, the light narrowing to a single intense spotlight on Tariq al-Sultan. Chef Julien, who had been making a discreet retreat to the kitchen, saw her trajectory and froze, his face paling to a mask of pure horror. He gave a frantic, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command to abort. But Amelia's focus was singular. She arrived at the table and waited for a beat of silence. It came when al-Sultan paused to take a sip of his mineral water. "Excuse me, Mr. al-Sultan," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a note of clarity that cut through the rarefied air. Al-Sultan lowered his glass, his expression one of profound annoyance. He did not look at her, but at the critic, a shared look of incredulity. "I did not ask for anything," he said, his tone dismissing her as a faulty appliance. "I know, sir. My apologies for the interruption," Amelia said, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the precipice. "I was just so fascinated by your identification of the saffron in the dish." A flicker of amusement crossed Al-Sultan's face. He turned his head slowly, regarding her for the first time, his eyes doing a quick, contemptuous scan. He was like a biologist examining a simple organism that had inexplicably learned to speak. "Fascinated? You?" he purred, the condescension thick in his voice. "And what, pray tell, would a girl like you know about the subtleties of saffron?" "I don't know much about Moroccan saffron, sir," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I know a great deal about the native flowers of Illinois. I grew up on a farm downstate. My grandmother was a healer, an herbalist. She taught me the old ways." The critic shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was a bizarre and unwelcome diversion from the script of sycophancy. "How quaint," Al-Sultan sneered, his amusement curdling into impatience. "Is there a point to this rustic anecdote, or are you simply auditioning for a role in a community theater production?" "There is a point, sir," Amelia said, finally meeting his gaze. The full force of his intimidating aura washed over her, a palpable pressure, but she held her ground. "What you're tasting, the note you described as honey and leather with a tragic bitterness, it isn't saffron at all. It's the stamen of the Caller Ho involucrata, the prairie fire blossom." The silence that followed was not quiet. It was a dense, heavy void that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The critic's pen hung frozen over his notepad. Chef Julian looked as though he might collapse. Al-Sultan set his water glass down with a soft, deliberate click. The faint smile on his lips was gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice losing its purr, becoming flat and cold as marble. "I'm saying Chef Morrow used a local ingredient," Amelia clarified, her words precise and even. "It's a flower that grows wild in the tallgrass prairies. It mimics saffron in color, but its flavor profile is entirely different. It's smokier, more honest. It tastes of the soil it comes from. It's a brilliant and daring choice, but it is not, with all due respect, the saffron of the Atlas." Every word was a perfectly placed charge, detonating the foundations of his carefully constructed authority. She hadn't just said he was wrong. She had explained why he was wrong, using a language he couldn't comprehend. The language of the earth, of tradition, of a truth that couldn't be bought. She had exposed his globe-trotting palate as a hollow sham, unable to distinguish a priceless foreign spice from a common American weed. For a long, breathless moment, Tariq al-Sultan looked utterly baffled. The mask of the supreme connoisseur had shattered, revealing the raw, naked shock of a man who had never, in his entire adult life, been contradicted, especially not by a servant. Then the shock receded, and a terrible, cold rage took its place, a deep, venomous fury that tightened the skin around his eyes and made his knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of the table. "You are insolent," he hissed. The words were barely a whisper, yet they carried more menace than a shout. "You stand there smelling of dishwater and cheap perfume, and you think your grandmother's weed-picking stories give you the authority to question me?" "This isn't about my authority, sir," Amelia replied, her own fear now being burned away by a strange, clarifying calm. She had said the truth. The consequences were secondary. It's about the truth of the ingredient, the truth of the chef's creation. "The truth?" Al-Sultan let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "Allow me to educate you about the truth, girl. The truth is a narrative, and I control the narrative. The critic from the New York Times is sitting right here. Tomorrow, 2 million people will read about Chef Morrow's genius in procuring the saffron of the Atlas. That will become the truth. And you," he stood up then, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her, "will become a forgotten ghost. You are fired." He turned his poisonous glare on Chef Julian, who was now stumbling toward the table, his face ashen. "Julian, get this thing out of my sight. and be prepared for the consequences of your staff's insubordination. I will decimate this restaurant. I will turn this building into a crater. I will salt the earth where it stood." Julian grabbed Amelia's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Miss Hayes, my office now." He was trying to pull her away, to mitigate the cataclysmic damage. But Amelia had one final stone to throw. She looked past the terrified chef, directly into Tariq al-Sultan's furious eyes. "You can write whatever story you want, sir," she said, her voice rising, clear and resonant in the deathly silent restaurant. "But a story can't change what's on the tongue. You can tell the world it's saffron, but you'll always know you tasted a wildflower and were completely, utterly fooled by it. A palate that can be deceived so easily isn't a gift. It's just numb." The word hung in the air. Numb. It was the perfect weapon. It didn't call him a liar. It didn't call him a bully. It rendered his entire identity, his sole claim to power in this world, utterly inert. A connoisseur without a palate. A king without a crown. A judge who was deaf, dumb, and blind. It was an accusation of a profound and personal emptiness. The blood drained from al-Sultan's face, then rushed back in a blotchy purple tide. For the first time, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a fraud on a witness stand, exposed by irrefutable evidence. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His usual weapons, wealth, rage, intimidation, were useless against this simple, devastating truth. The critic stared at his water glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. As Julian finally managed to hustle the terminated waitress toward the kitchen, a new sound broke the spell. It wasn't a gasp or a whisper. It was a single, sharp clap. Then another. The applause was coming from an elderly couple at a corner table, a quiet pair who were regulars. The old man, a retired history professor, was looking at Amelia with an expression of pure admiration. The sound, though small, was the ultimate act of defiance. It was the sound of the room choosing a new narrative. And in that moment, as the kitchen doors swung shut, Tariq al-Sultan, the scythe, the most feared man in the culinary world, looked utterly, undeniably, and profoundly numb. The swing doors of the kitchen closed, muffling the stunned silence of the dining room and plunging Amelia into the frantic, cacophonous world of the back of house. The clang of steel, the roar of gas burners, and the staccato shouts of the line cooks felt like a different universe from the Cold War she had just ignited. Julian released her arm, his hand trembling. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. "Are you insane, Amelia?" he hissed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Do you have a death wish? That man, he doesn't just write bad reviews. He erases people. He destroys them. For sport." "He was lying, chef," Amelia said, her voice quiet but firm. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving a hollow, trembling space in her stomach. "He was insulting your dish, your choice of ingredient. He was making you a part of his lie." "I don't care if he said it was dusted with powdered unicorn horn," Julian exploded, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "He was going to give us a rave in the Times. The critic was eating it up. We would have been saved. My loans, the payroll. Do you understand what you've done? You didn't just get yourself fired. You may have just sunk us all." He pointed a shaking finger toward the staff exit. "You're fired. Get your things. Go. Now. Before he decides to send someone back here to break my legs." Amelia nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She had expected this, but the reality of it, the pain and fear in Julian's eyes, was a heavy blow. She had acted on principle, but her principles didn't pay the salaries of the dishwashers and prep cooks who were now staring at her with wide, accusing eyes. She was a pariah. She walked in a daze to the small, cramped locker room, the sounds of the kitchen fading behind her. She stripped off her uniform, the armor she had worn for the last 2 years, and changed into her simple jeans and t-shirt. As she packed her bag, the full weight of her actions settled upon her like a physical shroud. She had lost her job, the one thing that kept her afloat in the expensive city and allowed her to send a little money home to her grandmother. Worse, she had made an enemy of a man who treated vengeance as a corporate strategy. She pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped out into the grimy back alley. The cool Chicago air felt sharp against her flushed cheeks. The distant symphony of the city, the rumble of the L train, the wail of a siren suddenly sounded menacing. She had stood up to a tyrant, but now she was alone in the dark, and the tyrant owned the world. "Miss Hayes!" The voice was deep and calm, startling her. She spun around to see a tall, broad-shouldered man leaning against the brick wall opposite the door. He was in his late 60s, with a kind, weathered face and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a simple, well-made suit that looked out of place in the greasy alley. It was the old man from the corner table, the one who had started the applause. His wife stood a few feet behind him, a small, elegant woman with a concerned expression. "You're Mr. Thompson, aren't you?" Amelia asked, recognizing him. "You and your wife come in every Thursday." "Guilty as charged, and call me George," he said, pushing himself off the wall. He had the sturdy, deliberate movements of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. "My wife, Eleanor, and we just wanted to say that what you did in there took more guts than a platoon of Marines." "Or more foolishness," Amelia murmured, pulling her worn jacket tighter. "I think I just destroyed a good man's restaurant." "You did no such thing," George said, his voice firm. "You gave that good man a choice, to live on his knees in a lie or to stand on his feet in the truth. What he does with that choice is up to him. But you reminded everyone in that room what integrity looks like." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "I should know. I've been on the receiving end of Tariq al-Sultan's brand of truth." Amelia looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. There was a history in that face, a deep-seated resilience. "You know him?" George let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I know him. My family owned Thompson & Sons Construction for 80 years. We were a Chicago institution. We built half the brownstones in Lincoln Park. We used solid oak, real copper flashing, foundations meant to last for centuries. 5 years ago, Al-Sultan decided he wanted our land for one of his glass monstrosities. He didn't make an offer. He launched an attack. He tied us up in frivolous lawsuits, bribed city inspectors to find phantom code violations, poached our best crews with insane offers, and then fired them a month later. He bled us dry until we had no choice but to sell him our legacy for 10 cents on the dollar. He called it market disruption. I called it theft." The story settled heavily in the alley air. George Thompson wasn't just a diner. He was a ghost from Al-Sultan's past conquests. His weekly dinners at Ethel, a restaurant in a neighborhood Al-Sultan was actively colonizing, suddenly felt less like a meal and more like an act of quiet defiance. "I'm so sorry," Amelia said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "Don't be sorry," George said, his expression hardening. "Be smart. He will not let tonight's humiliation go unanswered. He will come after you, not just your job. He'll look into your family, that farm you mentioned. Does your grandmother have a mortgage? Are her property taxes paid up? He will find a lever, Miss Hayes, and he will use it to crush you." A new kind of fear, colder and more personal than just being jobless, snaked around Amelia's heart. This wasn't about a restaurant anymore. This was about her home, her grandmother, the only things that mattered. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, the question aimed at the empty alley as much as at him. George looked at his wife, who gave a firm, encouraging nod. He then turned back to Amelia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the old builder's fire in his eyes. "For 5 years, I've watched that man devour this city, piece by piece," he said, his voice low and powerful. "I've been a footnote in his corporate reports, but tonight, you did something I never could. You didn't fight him on zoning laws or in a courtroom. You fought him where he lives, in that fragile, fraudulent ego of his. You found a flaw not in his business, but in his very soul." He stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "You can't fight his money, kid, but you have something he can never buy. You have authenticity, the real thing, the kind that comes from the dirt. He pretends to understand it, but you embody it." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. It read, "George Thompson, Master Carpenter and Restoration Specialist." "He thinks he's won. He thinks you're a bug he just swatted," George said. He will now proceed to destroy Chef Maro's reputation, to prove his own narrative, to make his lie the truth. But we're not going to let that happen. You and I, Miss Hayes, are going to give Mr. Al Sultan a lesson in honest ingredients. He tapped the card. He builds with soulless glass and steel. We are going to build a case against him with simple, solid, unbreakable truth. Amelia looked down at the card in her trembling hand, then back up at the determined old builder and his steadfast wife. An hour ago, she was a waitress. Now she was the unemployed primary target of a vindictive billionaire. But as she stood in that dark alley, she wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally. "All right, George," she said, her voice finding its footing again. "Where do we start?" Tariq al-Sultan did not process humiliation. He weaponized it. The soft applause for the waitress, the single piercing word, numb, had bypassed his intellect and lodged directly in the core of his pride. It was a wound that could only be salved by the total annihilation of its source. The onslaught began less than 12 hours later. It was not a frontal assault, but a campaign of 1,000 cuts, executed with the cold precision of a surgeon. The first target was Ethel. By 10 a.m., Chef Julian Morrow received calls from 3 of his main suppliers. His line of credit had been suspended. A new exclusive contract had been signed with Jamil Global Holdings, Al Sultan's primary corporation, and they were no longer permitted to sell to him. By noon, the city's health department arrived for a surprise top-to-bottom inspection, prompted by an anonymous tip about refrigeration issues. They swarmed the kitchen like locusts, armed with clipboards and thermometers. The second front was a media blitz. The critic who had been at the table, a man known for his poetic prose, published a scathing emergency blog post. It didn't mention the confrontation directly, but spoke of a profound disappointment at Ethel, of a chef whose reach exceeded his grasp and whose creations were marred by a confused, almost amateurish use of esoteric ingredients. He lamented the palpable tension in the dining room, blaming it on a breakdown in staff discipline. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, positioning Al Sultan as a discerning victim of a restaurant's meltdown. Ethel's reservation lines went silent, but the most venomous attack was reserved for Amelia. When she met George at a noisy, anonymous diner in Pilsen that afternoon, her face was ashen. She slid her phone across the sticky table. It was open to a county tax assessor's website, a property deed for a small, 10-acre farm in rural LaSalle County. "He found her," Amelia whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "An LLC based in Delaware made an offer on the land this morning, for 5 times its market value. My grandmother called me an hour ago. She was confused, excited. She thinks it's a miracle." George's face hardened. "It's no miracle. It's a vice. He's not just buying the land. He's buying your home, your history. He'll offer her a life estate. Let her live there until she passes. He'll look like a generous benefactor. But the message is for you. I own your past. I own your grandmother. I own you. Now be silent." "And there's more," Amelia said, her voice barely audible. "The offer is contingent on the farm passing an environmental soil and water survey. Suddenly, the EPA has received an anonymous complaint about improper disposal of agricultural waste on her property. They're sending an inspector next week. George, my grandmother, uses compost and ladybugs. She's the most organic person on the planet. It's a fabrication." "Of course it is," George said, his voice a low rumble of anger. "He'll pay a team of lawyers to find a trace of something, a pesticide from a neighboring farm that drifted over 20 years ago, and they'll declare her land a toxic site. The deal will collapse, her property value will be zero, and she'll be mired in fines and legal fees she can never pay. That's how he works. He doesn't just defeat you, he contaminates you." A wave of helpless panic washed over Amelia. This was beyond a lost job or a bad reference. This was a siege against her entire life, against the one person she loved most in the world. Al Sultan was a dragon, and he was breathing fire on her tiny, fragile world. "How can we possibly fight this?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "He's everywhere. He has an army of lawyers and accountants. We have—" "What? You're a carpenter and I'm an unemployed waitress." "We have the truth," George said, his calm a solid anchor in her storm of fear. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes focused and clear. Right now, he's a rampaging bull, smashing everything in sight. But a bull has no strategy. He's acting out of pure, wounded ego, and his entire rage is centered on the lie you exposed. The prairie fire blossom versus the saffron of the Atlas. He pushed a folded newspaper across the table. It was a society column. A small article noted that Tariq al-Sultan would be the guest of honor at the upcoming Grand Cru Culinary Gala, a black tie event celebrating Chicago's finest chefs. The keynote speaker was the Times critic. "This is his next move," George explained. "This is his victory lap. He and his pet critic will stand on that stage and reinforce the narrative. They will eulogize Ethel and talk about the tragedy of lost potential, all while cementing the myth of al-Sultan's infallible palate. He needs to make his lie the official, undisputed history of what happened." "So we need to stop him from telling that story," Amelia said, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. "No," George countered, a glint in his eye. "We can't stop him, so we're going to write him a better one. He wants to be seen as a man of the world, a man with a deep connection to the history and terroir of what he consumes. His entire persona is built on that lie. So let's look at his history, his terroir." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You said your knowledge came from your grandmother, from the soil of Illinois. Where does his come from? He peddles this fantasy about being descended from spice lords. Is it true? Where did Tariq al-Sultan really come from? Who was he before he was the Scythe?" The idea dawned on Amelia, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. They couldn't fight his power in the present. The siege was unwinnable on his terms. But the past was a different country with different rules. "So we don't investigate the restaurant or the health codes," Amelia said, thinking aloud. "We investigate him, his life, his family. We dig for his roots." "Exactly," George affirmed. "He's a man who builds glass towers that reflect the sky so you can't see what's inside them. But every building, no matter how tall, has a foundation. We need to find his. And I have a feeling it's not built on Moroccan saffron fields." The siege was on. Al-Sultan was using the immense power of his modern empire to bombard them from every direction. But Amelia and George were preparing a counteroffensive. They weren't armed with money or influence. They were armed with curiosity, a deep belief in the truth, in the simple, radical idea that somewhere in the forgotten, unglamorous history of a single man lay a story that could bring his entire glass kingdom crashing down. Their war room was the dusty workshop behind George Thompson's restoration business in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. The scent of sawdust and wood varnish replaced the sterile fear of Ethel. Instead of battle maps, the walls were covered with genealogical charts, old city maps of Detroit, and printouts from digitized immigration records. They operated on a single powerful premise. Tariq al-Sultan's lie about the saffron wasn't random. It was a profound act of psychological misdirection. It was a fantasy designed to conceal a truth he found unbearable. Their first move was to hire a private investigator, a grizzled old-timer George knew from his construction days. "Find out where al-Sultan's money first came from," George instructed him. "Not the big real estate deals, the seed money, the very first dollar." While the investigator dug into financial archives, Amelia took on a different task. She focused on his name. Al-Sultan meant the king in Arabic. It was too perfect, too theatrical. She spent days buried in online immigration and census databases, searching for variations. Jamil Tariq, Tariq Jamil. She cross-referenced them with birth records from major U.S. cities with large Middle Eastern populations. The breakthrough came late one night. It wasn't in a business filing, but in a high school yearbook. The 1978 Dearborn, Michigan Pioneer High Yearbook, digitized and uploaded by the local library. And there he was, in the junior class photos. Thinner, with a wild mane of dark hair and a look of sullen ambition, but unmistakably him. The name beneath the photo was not Tariq al-Sultan, it was Tariq Jamil. "George, look at this," Amelia said, her voice trembling with excitement. George peered at the screen. "Jamil, a common name, not royal at all." He looked at the club memberships listed under the photo. Debate club, mathletes, future business leaders of America. No gourmet club. The private investigator's report arrived the next day. It confirmed their finding. Tariq al-Sultan had legally changed his name in 1988, the same year he closed his first major real estate deal. The seed money for that deal, the investigator had discovered, came from the sale of a small family-owned business, the Blue Cedar Grill, a falafel and shawarma shop on Warren Avenue in Dearborn. It had been in the Jamail family for 2 generations. The lie was beginning to unravel. The descendant of spice lords was the son of a shawarma shop owner. The next step was a road trip. George and Amelia drove to Dearborn, a city that felt a world away from the gleaming towers of Chicago. They found the block where the Blue Cedar Grill had been. It was a Starbucks now, but next door was a small cluttered bakery that had been there for 50 years, run by an elderly Lebanese woman named Mrs. Aboud. She remembered the Jamails. "Oh yes, the Jamails," she said, her hands deftly shaping dough as she spoke. "Good people, hard workers. Tariq's grandfather, he started the shop. A master with spices. Not fancy spices, you understand. Cumin, coriander, garlic. But he had the touch. He made the best toum in the city. Tariq's father, less so, a sad man, but his mother, Layla." Mrs. Aboud's eyes grew misty. "Ah, Layla. She was the heart of that place. She had a garden behind the shop. She grew her own mint, her own parsley, and she had a special flower she used in the rice pudding. For color, you see. Made it a beautiful gold." Amelia's heart began to beat faster. "A flower? What kind of flower?" "I don't know the English name. We called it Zafaran al-Fakir," she said. "The poor man's saffron." She chuckled. "It was just a marigold. But Layla would say, 'It is not the price of the spice that matters. It is the love you put in the dish.'" Tariq, he hated that saying. He hated the shop. Ashamed, I think. When his mother died, he sold the place so fast, never looked back. Silence fell over the bakery, thick with the scent of anise and yeast. There it was, the origin story, the psychological fingerprint. The lie about the saffron of the Atlas was not just a random boast. It was a direct, violent rejection of the poor man's saffron of his childhood. It was his desperate attempt to wash the smell of his mother's marigolds and his grandfather's garlic from his hands. He hadn't just changed his name. He had tried to murder his own history. The man who judged the world on authenticity was the least authentic man of all, a hollowed-out shell of shame and ambition. On the drive back to Chicago, Amelia felt a profound shift. Her fear of al-Sultan was gone, replaced by a deep, aching pity. This wasn't a battle against a monster anymore. It was an intervention for a man at war with his own memories. "The culinary gala is in 2 days," George said, breaking the long silence. His voice was grim. "He'll get on that stage and he will pontificate about terroir and heritage, and it will all be a lie." "So what do we do?" Amelia asked. "We can't just stand up and call him Tariq Jamail." "No," George said, a slow, strategic smile forming on his lips. "That would be his game. Accusations and denials. We're going to do something much more powerful. He built his empire by erasing his past. We're going to give it back to him, in front of everyone." The Grand Cru Culinary Gala was the epitome of Chicago opulence. Held in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the air shimmered with diamonds and ambition. At the head table, Tariq al-Sultan sat enthroned, accepting the adulation of the city's culinary elite. The evening's program was running smoothly. The Times critic had just finished a glowing tribute, praising al-Sultan's once-in-a-generation palate and his courageous stand against the decline of standards. Now it was al-Sultan's turn. He approached the podium, bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight. "Food is truth," he began, his voice resonating through the ballroom. "An ingredient cannot lie. It speaks of its soil, its sun, its history. It is the duty of the discerning palate to listen to that story. And it is the tragedy of our modern age," he continued, a note of sorrow in his voice, "that so many have grown numb." He was about to launch into his thinly veiled attack on Ethel when a side door opened and 2 waiters entered the ballroom. They were not hotel staff. They were carrying large silver trays. One was Amelia Hayes, the other was Chef Julian Morrow. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Al Sultan froze at the podium, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Security guards started to move forward, but George Thompson, seated at a table near the front, stood up. With him stood a dozen other men and women, electricians, plumbers, small business owners, all people George had rallied, all people who had been bulldozed by Al Sultan in the past. They formed a quiet, solid barrier. "What is the meaning of this?" Al Sultan hissed into the microphone. Amelia and Julian did not speak. They moved with a quiet grace, placing a small porcelain bowl in front of every diner at the head table. Inside each bowl were 2 spoonfuls of rice pudding, side by side. One was a pale cream color, the other was a vibrant, beautiful gold. Amelia finally stepped up to a secondary microphone on the stage. Her voice, clear and calm, filled the silent room. "Mr. Al Sultan, or should we say, Tariq Jamal, you spoke of truth. We agree. So we've brought you a simple truth test." She gestured to the bowls. "One of these puddings is colored with the rarest saffron of the Atlas, worth thousands of dollars a pound. The other is colored with simple marigold petals, the Zafaran al-Fakir, the poor man's saffron, the kind your mother, Layla, used to grow in her garden behind the Blue Cedar Grill in Dearborn." A collective gasp swept the ballroom. The critics stared at his bowl as if it contained a viper. "You, sir," Amelia continued, her eyes locked on the man at the podium, "with your once-in-a-generation palate, should have no trouble telling us which is which. Please enlighten us. Show us all the difference between the king's spice and the humble flower of a loving mother." It was a perfect trap, a checkmate delivered on a spoon. He was cornered, exposed under the glare of 100 pairs of eyes. If he guessed, he risked being wrong, his entire persona crumbling in a single humiliating moment. If he refused, his cowardice would be a tacit admission of his fraudulence. Tariq al-Sultan stared at the 2 puddings, the pale, expensive one and the golden, worthless one. For a fleeting instant, the mask of the billionaire fell away. He was no longer the scythe. He was just Tariq Jamal, a little boy in the back of a shawarma shop, smelling the faint, earthy scent of his mother's marigolds and hating it. Hating the poverty it represented, hating the love he could never accept. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, becoming an indictment, a verdict. Then without a word, he turned away from the microphone, away from the bowls of pudding, away from the truth of his own life, and walked off the stage. He strode through the stunned crowd, a hollowed-out king abandoning his fraudulent kingdom, finally and utterly defeated by the simple, loving memory he had spent a lifetime trying to escape. The aftermath was not a sudden, explosive collapse, but a slow, grinding erosion of a carefully constructed myth. The story of the pudding test became an instant legend in the food world, whispered in kitchens from Paris to Tokyo. Tariq al-Sultan's empire of fear did not crumble. Real estate is built on firmer ground than reputation. But his power as a cultural arbiter vanished overnight. He became a punchline, the man with the numb palate, the shawarma king pretending to be a sultan. His pronouncements were now met with stifled laughter instead of terror. The scythe had been blunted, rendered harmless. For Ethel, the path back was not immediate. The damage from al-Sultan's campaign was real. But the story of the gala gave them something more valuable than good reviews: a soul. Chef Julian, free from the yoke of fear, rediscovered his passion. He closed Ethel for a month. When it reopened, the menu was transformed. The foams and gels were still there, but they were now used to enhance, not disguise, the honest flavors of the Midwest. The centerpiece of the new tasting menu was a dish called Layla's Garden, a tribute built around the smoky, delicate flavor of the prairie fire blossom. The restaurant didn't just recover, it was reborn, championed by a public that now saw it as a symbol of integrity. Amelia Hayes did not return to waiting tables. Chef Julian offered her a new position, one they created together: Director of Sourcing and Storytelling. Her job was to travel the forgotten back roads of the region, to meet the small farmers and foragers, to find the ingredients with the most honest stories. She brought her grandmother's wisdom into one of the country's finest kitchens. She wasn't just serving food anymore. She was curating truth. George Thompson went back to his workshop, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He established a small, nonprofit legal fund for independent business owners, a shield against the predatory tactics of giants like El Sultan. His quiet act of standing up in that ballroom had inspired dozens of others to stop being silent victims. One afternoon, months later, a small, unmarked package arrived for Amelia at the restaurant. Inside was an old faded photograph. It showed a smiling young woman with kind eyes standing in a small sunlit garden, her hands full of bright orange marigolds. There was no note, but Amelia knew. It was a message from a ghost, a quiet admission from a broken man, a final, unspoken acknowledgement of the truth he could no longer deny. Amelia showed the world that true power is not the ability to impose your narrative on others. It is the courage to live your own, to honor the soil you came from, and to understand the simple, profound fact that no lie, no matter how gilded, can ever truly satisfy a hunger for the truth.